A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corn. We're coming into the fourth day of the conflict between Israel, the US, and Iran. And this is the first day where we've had a significant abatement of the missiles, which the IDF did say would be happening. And due to the successful degradation of not only the air defenses, which allows the US and Israel to gain aerial superiority, but also the strikes against the actual launch sites and the depots of these missiles located throughout Iran. And what I'd love to talk about today is we've talked about the actual constitution of the Iranian ballistic missile program, about how it's actually it's quite a heterogeneous bank of missiles that have been developed since about the 1980s and the Iraq-Iran war, and the different generations that have been brought since then. And what is interesting about it is that when we hear in the news about ballistic missiles, it tends to be left to that. And I remember in the last war asking if the Iranian missiles were technically ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the answer is no. Their range has been capped at essentially 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers with the Sejal. That's the longest range rocket that they have. What's very significant about this is two things. Firstly, to preempt the answer to the ICBM question, so we can spend our time talking about other things in this episode. The ICBM threshold is apparently about 5,500 kilometers, so they're substantially below what could even be considered by experts an ICBM. But they're also not even remotely close to being able to target the US. Iran to US 10 to 11,000 kilometers, and the reason we'll see these differences is that Iran is a pretty big place between the furthest west that they could be launching and the furthest east. We're looking at a difference of approximately, to Israel, 1,200 kilometers. So if their rocket arsenal caps out at about 2,000 to 2,500 at their longest range, and the US is 10,000 kilometers at least, then we're talking about they're not even 25% the way there yet. And the assessment from the department, the US Defense Intelligence Agency, responsible for military intelligence collection, is that this remains basically the situation, and that therefore the US isn't directly militarily threatened by the Iranian ballistic missile arsenal, at least on the US mainland. Its overseas bases in the Gulf are, as we've seen, but the US homeland is not under threat from these ballistic missiles. And I think that actually changes the way we look at this war in the first place, because it is a joint threat insofar as the US is operating in the region, but not directly to the US in the same way that it is to Israel. And what's also worth talking about, now that we can put to the side the fact that this isn't an ICBM arsenal, is the distinctions in range within this arsenal that it does have, ranging from the SRBMs, or the short-range ballistic missiles, through to the MRBMs, or medium-range ballistic missiles, with a range of between 1,000 and 3,500 kilometers. And this is where we see the Fatah, the Khyber Shikan, and the Shahab 3. I was trying to work out last year what the speeds of these were, and this is one of the cases where I thought that what you can do with open source information, intelligence, and AI, and all those things in combination, is pretty powerful. If we look at the known maximum velocity of these rockets and the potential launch sites, and we can calculate approximately what the difference is, and it would translate to a difference I calculated in warning time that Israel has of about an additional 5 minutes if they launched from the far east of the country. You might be able to corroborate or correct those numbers, but basically there's a strategic advantage that Israel has in pushing, in working from west to east, in targeting these launch sites. So my question, Herman and Corin, is twofold. Firstly, if that is the battle plan, because Israel has been sounding some cautious notes that Iran still has a big inventory, and it still has a lot of these launch sites. Now, I presume that wherever Iran has launched from in the past becomes a known entity, and even some places they haven't launched from are probably on the radar. But if they are being pushed to the east, the question is if they have capabilities throughout the country that they can just roll over to. I imagine that they do, and that could be the trajectory of Israel's progress, because the US has said today that the biggest strikes haven't come yet, and Israel has said very clearly that we might have seen a dramatic decrease today in the launches, but there's no room for complacency with regard to either the nuclear threat or the simple kinetic missile threat, which we've seen in the last 48 hours can be very deadly in its own right. The other thing I'd like to talk about, Herman and Corin, and we might have touched upon this in some of the episodes, is the liquid versus solid fuel question. Liquid fuel was the latest of their innovations in ballistic missiles. The Iranians, the Khyber Shikan, the Fatah, and the Sejil are preloaded, and the difference, I gather, is that the liquid fuel, the Shahab and the Imad, require refueling, and that's a significant strategic weakness in terms of their visibility. So if Iran's solid fuel arsenal is degraded and the Western launch sites are eliminated, those two things can be real battle changers for Israel, and we'll finally get the peace that we've been waiting for. So that's basically what I want to ask Herman and Corin. A lot of questions in one, really. But when we're looking at the constitution of Iran's program, just from the perspective of its how far its missiles can go, what are the tactics that we might expect to see Israel pursuing in trying to degrade this as far as possible, and what would be the path towards clearing out everything? Because that's what we're going for. The US has said that regime change isn't an explicit goal of this operation, at least from their standpoint. From Israel's standpoint, we certainly can't have the situation where even with kinetic ballistic missiles, that this is a thing that becomes a fixture in our lives. So Herman and Corin, let's talk today about some more of the details of the Iranian ballistic missile program in today's episode of My Word Promise.
Well, it is day 4 of what has become an incredibly intense week here in Jerusalem. The sounds of the city have definitely changed over the last 72 hours, but today there is a different kind of energy in the air, as Daniel mentioned in the audio he sent over this morning. We are seeing the first real signs of what the military is calling a significant abatement in the missile threat.
It is a significant moment, Corin. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, looking at the data coming in from the last few days of operations, the sheer scale of the Iranian ballistic missile program is finally being laid bare. Daniel really hit on a crucial point in his prompt. We often talk about these weapons in the abstract, but when you are living through a conflict where they are the primary tool of power projection, the technical details suddenly become very, very real.
It is a stark reality, and I think it is important for us to dive into exactly what Daniel was asking about. He wanted to understand the composition of this arsenal, the history behind it, and why things like fuel types and launch locations matter so much for our safety here on the ground. It is easy to get lost in the headlines, but the engineering and the geography tell the real story.
That is the starting point. And to understand where we are today, on March 2nd, 2026, we really have to look back at the late 1980s. The Iranian missile program was born out of desperation during the Iran-Iraq War. People forget the War of the Cities, where Baghdad and Tehran were just lobbing modified Scuds at each other. Iran had almost nothing back then. They had to rely on Libyan and North Korean shipments of Scud-B missiles, which they called the Shahab-1.
And that feeling of being defenseless against aerial bombardment really was the catalyst. It created a strategic doctrine that has not changed in 40 years. Since they could not build a modern air force due to sanctions and political isolation, They went all in on missiles as their primary means of long-range strike.
That is right. They viewed missiles as their version of a strategic bomber fleet. And when you look at the evolution from those early Shahab 1 and Shahab 2 missiles, which were basically just reverse-engineered Soviet technology, to what we are seeing today, the progress is technically impressive, even if it is terrifying. Daniel mentioned the range cap of 2,500 kilometers. That is a very deliberate choice.
That is because once you cross the 5,500-kilometer mark, you are officially in intercontinental ballistic missile territory. By keeping their range under 3,000 kilometers, Iran has spent decades claiming their program is regional and defensive, even though a 2,000-kilometer range covers every square inch of Israel, parts of Southeast Europe, and every major United States base in the Persian Gulf.
It is a clever bit of strategic ambiguity. But let us look at the specific generations Daniel was asking about. You have the Shahab 3, which for a long time was the backbone of their medium-range force. That is a liquid-fueled missile based on the North Korean Nodong-1. It has a range of about 1,300 kilometers, which is just enough to reach Tel Aviv from western Iran. But the Shahab 3 is old tech now. It is slow to launch and, as Daniel pointed out, it has a major weakness.
The liquid fuel. Let us break that down, because I think that is one of the most important points for people to understand. Why is a liquid-fueled missile such a liability in a modern conflict?
It comes down to chemistry and logistics. Liquid fuels, especially the types used in these older missiles, are often highly corrosive and volatile. You cannot just leave the missile sitting in a silo or on a truck fully fueled for months at a time. The fuel would eat through the tanks. So, when the order comes to launch, you have to bring out the fueling trucks. You have to pump hundreds of gallons of volatile chemicals into the airframe. This process can take 30 minutes, an hour, or even longer.
And in the age of high-resolution satellite imagery and persistent drone surveillance, an hour is an eternity.
It is a death sentence. If an Israeli or American drone sees a fueling convoy gathering around a launch pad, that missile is going to be destroyed before it ever leaves the ground. That is why Iran has pushed so hard into solid fuel technology. The Sejil, the Khaibar Shekan, and the new Fatah missiles that Daniel mentioned are all solid fueled.
And that means the fuel is basically a rubbery solid block already inside the missile casing, right?
That is a good way to put it. Think of it like a giant bottle rocket. It is ready to go the moment you push the button. You can keep these missiles hidden in those underground missile cities, drive them out on the transporter erector launcher, fire them in 5 minutes, and then drive away before the counterstrike arrives. This shoot and scoot capability is what makes the modern Iranian arsenal so much more dangerous than the old Shahab fleet.
It also changes the math for our defense systems. If you have a liquid-fueled missile, you might get an hour of pre-launch warning. With solid fuel, the first warning you get is the infrared signature of the launch itself detected by a satellite.
And that brings us to Daniel's question about launch locations and warning times. This is where the geography of Iran becomes a huge factor. Iran is a massive country nearly 3 times the size of France. If they launch a missile from the Kermanshah province in the west, the distance to Jerusalem is roughly 1,200 kilometers.
Okay, so let us do the math. A medium-range ballistic missile like the Khaibar Shekan travels at hypersonic speeds during its terminal phase, but its average speed over the whole flight path might be around 6 or 7 times the speed of sound.
Right. Let us say Mach 6 for a conservative estimate. That is about 2 kilometers per second. If the distance is 1,200 kilometers, you are looking at a flight time of 600 seconds, or exactly 10 minutes. That is not a lot of time to get to a bomb shelter.
But Daniel mentioned that pushing the launch sites further east offers a strategic advantage. If they move the launch pads back to the eastern provinces, near the border with Afghanistan, you are adding another 1,000 kilometers or more to that flight path.
That is the logic. A launch from eastern Iran increases the distance to over 2,200 kilometers, at the same speed that doubles the flight time to roughly 18 or 20 minutes. From a civilian perspective, that extra 10 minutes is the difference between an orderly evacuation and a panic. But from a military perspective, it is even more significant.
Because it gives the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 interceptor systems more time to track the trajectory and calculate an intercept point.
That is the core of it. The further away the launch occurs, the higher the arc of the missile. To reach a greater distance, the missile has to go higher into space before it begins its descent. This gives our radar systems, like the Green Pine radar, a much cleaner look at the target. It also means the missile is in the mid-course phase of its flight for a longer duration. That is the phase where it is most vulnerable to the Arrow 3 system, which intercepts targets outside the atmosphere.
So why would Iran ever choose to launch from the east if it gives us more warning time? Is it just about protecting their own assets?
That is exactly it. The Western launch sites are much closer to Israeli and American strike capabilities. If they launch from the west, they are within range of a wider variety of counterattacks, including cruise missiles and even long-range artillery or special operations. By moving the sites east, they are trying to put their launchers out of reach of anything but the most sophisticated long-range stealth bombers. It is a trade-off. They get more survivability for their launchers, but they give us more warning time for our defenses.
It is a fascinating chess match. We actually touched on some of the logistics of this back in episode 744 when we talked about the math of missile defense. But seeing it play out now in real time, it highlights how much the physical location of a battery changes the strategic calculus.
It certainly does. And we have to talk about the Fata missile. Daniel specifically mentioned it, and it has been a huge part of the propaganda coming out of Tehran lately. They claim it is a hypersonic missile, meaning it can maneuver at speeds exceeding Mach 5.
We should be careful with that term, though. Most ballistic missiles are technically hypersonic because they travel very fast when they re-enter the atmosphere. But what Iran is claiming with the Fatah is that it can change course while moving at those speeds, which would make it incredibly difficult for an interceptor like the Arrow to hit it.
Right, the difference between a predictable ballistic arc and a maneuverable re-entry vehicle. If the Fatah can actually do what they claim, it would be a game changer. However, many analysts, myself included, are skeptical of the level of control they have at those speeds. To maneuver at Mach 10, you need incredibly advanced heat shielding and actuators that can survive the plasma buildup around the nose cone.
It is one thing to show a fancy-looking rocket at a parade in Tehran. It is another thing to have it successfully navigate a zigzag pattern while traveling at 3 kilometers per second. But even if the maneuvering is limited, the speed alone reduces our reaction window.
It does. And that leads to the question of how you actually degrade this program. Daniel asked about the tactics Israel might employ. We have seen some of that over the last few days. It is not just about shooting the missiles down in the air. That is the last line of defense. The real work happens much earlier in the kill chain, what we call left of launch.
You are talking about the depots and the supply lines.
That is the key. You have to hit the factories where the solid fuel is cast. That is a very delicate chemical process. If you disrupt the supply of ammonium perchlorate or the specialized binders they use, you can shut down production for months. You also target the specialized trucks, the transporter erector launchers. Iran only has a finite number of these highly specialized vehicles. Every time one is destroyed, their ability to saturate our defenses decreases.
And then there is the cyber element. We know that these modern missiles rely on sophisticated guidance systems, often using a mix of inertial navigation and satellite signals. If you can spoof those signals or inject malware into the ground control stations, you can make a missile miss by miles or even fail to launch entirely.
We have seen reports of that happening in previous years. There were several high-profile failures in the Iranian space program, which is closely linked to their missile development. Many people suspect those were not accidents. But the long-term path to eliminating the threat, as Daniel asked, is much more complicated. You cannot just bomb your way out of a program this deeply entrenched.
Because it is buried, literally. Those missile cities are hundreds of meters underground, carved into the sides of mountains. Even the most powerful conventional bunker busters have trouble reaching them.
Right, so the strategy is degradation and containment. You make the cost of launching so high and the success rate so low that the weapons lose their strategic value. If Iran spends $10 million on a missile and it gets intercepted by a $3 million Arrow 3, they are losing the economic war. If they launch 100 missiles and none of them hit a significant target, the political leverage those missiles provide evaporates.
That is an interesting point. It is a war of attrition, not just of hardware, but of credibility. If the shield is proven to be stronger than the sword becomes a very expensive paperweight.
That is what we have seen today, on day 4. The degradation of their air defenses has allowed for more precise strikes on their launch infrastructure. It is a cascading effect. Once you take out the radars that protect the missile sites themselves become vulnerable.
I want to go back to the distinction between the different ranges. Daniel mentioned short-range ballistic missiles versus medium-range. Within the Iranian borders, they've been moving a lot of short-range systems like the Fateh 110. These have a range of only about 300 kilometers.
Those are the ones they usually give to their proxies, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. From a regional perspective, the Fateh 110 is arguably more dangerous because it is incredibly accurate. It uses global positioning system and electro-optical guidance to achieve a circular error probable of less than 10 meters.
For the listeners who might not know, circular error probable is the measure of a missile's precision. It means that 50% of the missiles fired will land within that radius. 10 meters is basically a bullseye for a weapon with a 500-kilogram warhead.
It is, and that is the real shift we have seen in the last decade. The Iranian program has moved from just hit the city to hit that specific building. The Shahab 3 was a city killer. It was inaccurate and relied on a massive warhead to do damage. But the Khaibar Shekin and the Fatah are precision instruments. That is why the defense has to be so perfect. We cannot afford to let even one through if it is aimed at a power plant or a high-rise.
It really puts the pressure on the logistics side of things. We talked about this in episode 697, the idea of the nuclear truck and how they unify these systems. If they can put a small, precise warhead on a mobile launcher, the entire country becomes a front line.
It does. And to Daniel's point about the path forward, I think we have to look at the international cooperation. The only way to truly eliminate the threat is through a combination of intense military pressure and a renewed diplomatic framework that addresses the missile program specifically. For years, the focus was only on the nuclear side, but as we are seeing now, the delivery systems are just as dangerous.
It is like having a bullet but no gun, or a gun but no bullet. You need both to be a threat. If you ignore the missiles, you are only solving half the problem.
You are right. And the technology is spreading. We are seeing Iranian missile designs appearing in other conflict zones around the world. It is a global proliferation issue. But here in Jerusalem, it is a very local issue. Every time the siren goes off, you are reminded that someone 1,000 miles away has spent 40 years perfecting the art of sending a piece of metal to your exact coordinates.
It is a sobering thought. But the fact that we are seeing this abatement today is a testament to the effectiveness of the multi-layered defense strategy. It is not just the arrow. It is the integration of Iron Dome for the short-range stuff, David's Sling for the medium range, and Arrow for the big ballistic threats. It is a shield made of many layers of math and physics.
And that math is winning right now. The success rate of the interceptions over the last few days has been unprecedented. It is forcing the Iranian command to rethink their entire strategy. If their primary weapon is being neutralized, what do they have left?
That is the big question for the coming weeks. Does this lead to a de-escalation because they realize their hand is weak, or do they double down on more experimental tech?
I suspect we will see a bit of both. They will continue to push the hypersonic narrative, but behind the scenes they will be scrambling to find ways to overwhelm the defense. That is why we cannot get complacent. The moment you think you have solved the missile problem, the other side finds a new way to fly.
Well, I think we have given Daniel a pretty deep dive into the mechanics of this. From the liquid-fueled relics of the 80s to the solid-fueled, high-speed threats of today, the evolution is a mirror of Iran's broader strategic goals.
It truly is. It is a program built on a foundation of scars from the Iran-Iraq War, fueled by a desire for regional dominance and currently being tested by the most advanced defense network in human history.
Before we wrap up, I want to remind everyone that if you are interested in the deeper history of some of these specific missiles, you should definitely check out episode 717, where we did a full breakdown of the Iranian arsenal's development during the 2000s. It provides a lot of context for how they got from the Scud to the Khaibar Shekin.
And episode 718 is a great companion to this one, where we looked at the other side of the coin, Israel's own Jericho program, and the concept of strategic ambiguity. It is a compelling mirror image of what we discussed today.
Definitely. We live in a world where these invisible arcs across the sky define the boundaries of power. Understanding how they work is the first step in feeling a little less helpless when the sirens start.
Well said, Corn. And hey, to our listeners, if you have been following the show for a while and you find these deep dives helpful, please take a moment to leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. We have been doing this for over 900 episodes now, and your feedback really helps new people find the show, especially during times like this when clear information is so important.
It really does make a difference. We appreciate all of you for sticking with us. You can find our full archive and a way to get in touch with us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there for the subscribers, and a contact form if you want to send us a prompt like Daniel did.
Thanks to Daniel for the prompt today. It was a timely one, and it gave us a chance to geek out on some serious ballistics math.
Always a pleasure, Herman. Stay safe, everyone, and we will be back with another episode soon. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay curious and keep looking up, but maybe stay near a shelter just in case. Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth.